Get them from? Anyone not have a handout? I don't have a handout. Could I borrow your handout a minute? Is that an extra one here? Everyone has one but me. Oh yes. The handout will be helpful to some. It's sort of a summary of stuff I'm going to say. You start to page through it, and you get a lot of regular type stuff. And you see that the overview of the day is that we're going to have 4 presentations, and each one will be on a separate gospel. We'll start with Mark, and then Matthew, Luke, and John. We'll look at the resurrection accounts in those 4 gospels. And then after you get through that, you see a chart, the empty tomb chart, as you're paging through. And then for those people who don't have a New Testament with them, and we have at least one text here from Luke, that's the Emmaus story to meditate on, some suggestions on how to do that. And then there's a reflections I wrote recently on the resurrection as the Big Bang, second Big Bang. Someone asked me the other day, just yesterday, was that an original? I once said, if I ever have an original thought, I will let you know. And they said, is that an original thought? I said, as far as I know, yes. Of course, you never can be sure. You might have read something. And then there's music for the Mass. So that's stuff in the handout that will be helpful. Now, my hope is that everyone sort of takes the day in your own way. There's a lot of ways to deal with the material. You can do anything you want with it, and I'm going to give the presentations, and then the invitation is to respond in some way. Private meditation, in the notes there's a suggestion of how to meditate on the particular passages that are put before us, all resurrection accounts. Those who want to discuss, the classroom is going to be used for that. Classroom is next to the kitchen, between the restrooms and the kitchen. Classroom, in there are round tables. And anybody at the breaks who wants to discuss with others can go in that room and form groups and do that. People who want to be by themselves can go find their own quiet spots and so on. The first presentation this morning is going to be by far the longest and try to set the stage for the day. The other presentations will be much briefer and just highlight particular gospels. And as people know, I like to work with little vignettes, and that's what I'll do. I got 4 different people in mind as I give these presentations on the gospels. And my first one is Abraham. And then everyone knows the second one will be Sarah. Anyway, that starts the pattern. So first I'm dealing with Abraham. Now Abraham is looking forward to this day. He's here in the group. And here's a sort of Abraham's piety. Abraham's very serious about his Catholic faith, always has been, lifelong Catholic, and been immersed in it all. And when he thinks of his piety, what some have called the catechism of his heart. I sort of like that word. There's an official Catholic catechism. You know, it's got a lot of stuff in it. Well, we all have a catechism of our own hearts. That's the part of the faith that influences us, that really is real, that directs our behavior, that gives us motivation. So I'm interested all day today in the catechism of the heart as starting points. So Abraham has his own catechism of the heart, what his piety is based on. And for Abraham, he's very centered on, when he thinks about Christ, he's very centered on the crucifixion. If you ask him what's the scene or what's the artwork in this building that he likes, it's the Adam Grant crucifixion that's in the Daily Chapel. For him, when he thinks about Christ, that's it. It's the crucified, suffering Lord who loved us so much that he died on the cross. That's how he sees him. That's how he thinks about him. When he thinks liturgically and the catechism of his heart, the big feast for him is Christmas. Christmas really is emotional for him. It brings back childhood memories. That's sort of the center of what his faith is all about. He likes to do the stations. That's been a traditional devotion of his. He'll probably today walk the stations here, starting over there and go all the way around and end up with the 14th station, which will be the burial of Jesus. So we begin to get a fix on his piety and where it is centered and what sort of things really move him and shape him. Put another way, Abraham has very little sense of the resurrection in his own life. The resurrection is not, when he thinks of Christ, he doesn't think of the resurrected Christ, he thinks of the crucified Christ. It's Christmas, not Easter, that is the big feast for him. And he has, when he prays, he has very little sense of praying to the risen Christ or being in concert with the risen Christ. He's thinking of Jesus, the historical Jesus, the earthly Jesus, who is his model and guide for how he's going to live his life. So it comes out that Abraham, piety is limited. Now Abraham is very interested in growing and developing. And he's taken a shot at it before. He once went to a lecture on the resurrection. And it was very much of a critical approach, showing the inconsistencies in the stories of the resurrection and so on. And it scared him. It really frightened him. He thought, my heavens, if they're going to take these stories critically, just a quick glance at it showed him, boy, they can devastate us with criticism of these stories. And so he backed off. He became very fearful of any serious intellectual discussion of the resurrection because he thought it would undercut his faith and become a problem for him. Now I want to sort of analyze how Abraham got there. Abraham's a product of his training. The theologians who wrote the books that influenced the seminary professors and influenced the priests who ended up teaching him, gave out just exactly what he got. It's not that he got it wrong. He got it just right. Just exactly the way it was taught to him. Great centered on the sufferings of Christ and the crucifixion, all of that. Very little in the textbooks, theological textbooks, on the theology of the resurrection. Very little in the creed. Very little said about the resurrection of the body. That's a tough notion. We say it in the creed. Very interesting. We don't say, I believe in the immortality of the soul, but if you ask Abraham about the catechism of his heart, it's got nothing to do with the resurrection of the body. It's got everything to do with the immortality of the soul. This sort of sense of heaven is that his soul's going to escape from his body someday and to put the body in the tomb, and his soul will go to heaven and be happy there with God forever. So it's a standard kind of piety that he learned. He didn't get it wrong, learned it that way. And there's reasons why. I'm not sure anybody's really interested in it here, but I'll say it just briefly. It's very different in the West. If Abraham had grown up in the Eastern Catholic churches and the Uniate churches, for example, or in the Orthodox world, it would all look very different to him. The transfiguration would be a big item in his piety. The risen Christ who divinized us would be different. So that the East and the West split in their understanding of Christ, fundamental notions. And in the West, it became very much of what we call a juridical notion. Salvation had to do with Christ paying a price for sin. God almost pictured like a just judge who's going to demand from Christ the worst kind of sufferings and pay the penalty for the sins of humanity. And then that would bring forgiveness of sins and allow us to get to heaven. So in the West, very much of the word juridical catches. It's legal. It's a ransom that is paid to God. In the East, very different kind of understanding of what Christianity is all about, what Christ is about, and so on. Very much more of a sense that God's power through the resurrection divinizes us, changes us. So that's one reason why we ended up with the kind of piety that Abraham knows. Now, Abraham's in the right place today. Not because his piety doesn't work, it does, but because Abraham's interested in growing. He doesn't want to get static in his faith. He wants to have a dynamism. He wants to have new thoughts. He wants to get excited about it. He wants to see it in different ways. Oh, he's open to different perspectives. And so, in that sense, he's in the right place. Because now we are going to emphasize that whole other side of all of this, what we'll call the eastern side of this whole notion of who Christ is, and so on. Now, as he reads the stories, and I'm going to want him to read the stories in Mark's gospel, that's where I'm going with this, he needs to do so with a prayerful, open spirit. He has to listen to the Spirit. He's got to see how those passages speak to him. They're poetic in a sense. They're imaginative kinds of stories. It's not going to work just to do it cerebrally. It's not just going to work to deal with those stories in some sort of rational basis. He's got to be open in his meditation today to how the stories will make an impact on his whole person and on his heart. But at the same time, I don't want Abraham to walk around with this great fear that if he analyzes this whole thing intellectually or listens to what the scholars have to say, he's going to get in big trouble, that he's going to lose his faith. Well, I don't believe that's going to happen to him. It's true. As soon as he starts reading the accounts and then he's serious to say there's intellectual questions going to arise. No mature adult can read those stories without intellectual questions. And the main thing is because they don't jibe. The stories don't fit together. His brain isn't going to be able to make a coherent account out of them. It's one of the reasons I gave you that chart about the stories in the four Gospels about the empty tomb. I mean, you'll never sort it out. There's a guy who wrote a book recently trying to do that. I think it's an unsuccessful book. I mean, you can't do it. And as soon as you look at the chart, and I'd offer that for your private time, you'll begin. Well, let's just take a look at it a minute here. The chart, the empty tomb. The purpose of the chart is to show how the stories differ. And it differs in terms of the names of the people who are involved and a lot of other details and who appears to them, what's the message they get, and especially what do they do with it. I mean, if you don't get, I just make one point out of the whole chart. In Mark's gospel, after the women are told, go tell the disciples, they don't do it. They don't do it. After the heavenly messenger tells them to do it. In Matthew, you see, they do go tell them. I mean, that's like big time difference. You know? I mean, also, I would think that we do have those mics that we can get around to people. It helps everyone to hear. The other thing to point out is that I would like for us to have an opportunity to share the fruit of our reflection at the Mass. We'll have a dialogue homily, which will give people a chance. I'm sort of looking for, well, I concentrated on Matthew and I got this out of it, sort of thing. In other words, we can't have 105 people giving 10-minute speeches, but you can do a lot if people would, say, major insight came from Mark for me and it was this. So at least we're going to offer that opportunity at the Mass at 4:45. And then I thought we could offer it, too, as part of the question period here. Anyway, do we have questions or comments that anyone wants to make?
Brother Jim, I have one.
Yes, Judy?
It's nothing profound. It's just a question. Oh, okay. It's just a question that's kind of bothered me as I read through the Bible in general. And that's, it would appear to me that you either have to take the Bible on faith, or else you have to spend a lifetime questioning it. Yeah. Because it doesn't add up, and I know that there's a lot of people who do that, they spend their lives studying it. But
well, that's a good question, and actually I think a profound one. How do we end up dealing with the Scriptures? There's, I would say, two major ways of reading them. One is to just read it as a story or as touching your heart. You can pick it up and read it at any point. You could get into a reading program where you could read straight through the Gospel of Luke or straight through one of the other Gospels. You could read the whole of the Bible. You could read Paul's epistles and just see what you get out of it. And read, as I said at the beginning, most importantly, read with an open heart and just see what happens and try to be responsive. So you can do that. Another more what do I want to say, reflective way of reading we call Lectio Divina, and that is where you don't try to read a bunch of the Bible, but you read it till a thought comes. Typical Lectio Divina, that means Lectio, reading, Divina, sacred reading. This comes from the Benedictine tradition, and you would pick it up and you can you'd say a prayer and then start to read, and then when an idea would come, or a thought or a feeling, you'd stay with it. Part of my instructions for suggestions for reading today, where if it comes, stay with it. Let it float around in your mind, think about it, pray about it, talk to God about it, and try to experience it in various ways. So that's another way of reading without any criticism. The second way, let me finish. I'm using it as a springboard, obviously, but the second way to read it is more critically, but you don't have to be a scholar to do it. I often recommend that people get the Catholic Study Bible, Personal Study Bible, and in just a couple pages before each of the books, we'll give you the historical setting, the intention of the author, main ideas and themes, and so on. I think someone's got one right there, don't they? Yeah. That's the Catholic Study Bible. And the notes in there are excellent, and they're the fruit of all this scholarship, but you get it in condensed form, and actually within just a few minutes of reading like that, you can get major ideas about it. Now, so that would be another way of reading it, with a more extensive commentary. I got on your reading list Raymond Brown's Introduction to the New Testament, which would have more on it, and then there would be little boxed versions like major ideas in this book, and you could get it in one page that way. And that's helpful to read in this more critical vein. But I would say that, to get back to what I think is behind the question, and that is, we believe, as a result of modern biblical scholarship, that we have a substantially correct picture of Jesus in the Gospels. Now that, we've gone through phases on that, and if a lecturer was doing this in the 1950s, early 50s, you might get a different sort of slant on it. But modern scholarship has advanced, and the general thing that's happened is we now feel more confident of the historicity of the Gospels. We feel more confident that we have a substantially correct picture of Jesus. And that, I mean, that's the fruit of scholarship, and you're right, it's been a lifetime to verify that, but most of us don't verify any of the things that we know personally. We don't. About anything. Science, we take the results of what the scientists tell us and so on in all fields. We can only be an expert on one tiny phase of life, the thing you wrote your dissertation on or something. You're the reigning expert on it. But tiny little phase of knowledge. So we do that generally. But there is that really positive sense these days that we know an awful lot about Jesus of Nazareth. And we have a substantially correct picture of him. He did grow up in Nazareth, and his parents were Mary and Joseph. And he was baptized by John the Baptist, and he did go about preaching, and he did tell parables, and he did work miracles. And he was crucified under the reign of Pilate, probably in the year 30. And we know for sure there was a group of followers who were terribly dispirited, done in after his death, and who soon after became courageous witnesses. We know that. All that stuff I just said, you can be pretty sure is right and true. That's what we know. And then you're faced with the question, how can this be, especially this transformation of these group of people and their courageous behavior afterwards and their wholehearted commitment. This is a phenomenon in human history that's very difficult to explain, to understand. And of course, one explanation is that he was raised from the dead. One explanation is that he lives, that his power is at work. So there's difficult questions behind that, but I can tell you the direction of modern biblical scholarship is that way, more optimistic about what we can know about the historical Jesus. And anybody who wants to deny any of the rest of it still has to account for the fact that there's 1 billion people walking around saying, I bet my life on Christ. That's an empirical fact that needs to be looked at. It's an empirical fact that there's the Sistine Chapel and Bach's St. Matthew's Passion. You know, those are things that exist that one needs to look for explanation. Jim?
And I thought I could add that in my lifetime, biblical scholarship has developed to the point where just not Catholic friends of mine know about the Bible. Methodist friends of mine aren't the only ones that know about the Bible. They all have questions, and in these days, all of the denominations, books are coming out where you have a Catholic priest, a Protestant theologian, you know, and they're so everybody's ideas, all the churches, the worshipers, are putting their ideas together in books now. So that when this guy comes up and says, I don't believe anything in the Bible, that's just a bunch of baloney, you've got all sorts of, not just Catholic people, but...
Yeah, that's a point is well taken, Jim. And in the Catholic world, we always have to be grateful to the Protestant scholars who led the way in the biblical studies. It was Catholics were really not allowed to do historical critical method until 1943. For 2 centuries, that's Divino Afflante Spiritu, the encyclical of Pius XII, that gave set loose the Catholic biblical scholars. That's always important for us to remember in terms of filtering knowledge. In other words, it was only in about 1959 that a teacher arrived in the state of Ohio who knew modern biblical criticism. That was Father Eugene Maley in Cincinnati. In other words, once the Pope said in 1943, okay, we Catholics can join the Protestants in doing this scholarship, then it took time to get people trained, had to learn the languages, had to go to the best schools, and so on. It was only in 1959 or 60 that knowledge became available in the state of Ohio. That's quite remarkable, and it tells us a lot. And I think the other thing is that the remarkable progress of Catholic biblical scholarship since then. So the Protestant world, for example, would recognize Father Raymond Brown as one of the greatest scholars on John's Gospel. So that's one of the great glories of the time since 1943, second half of that century, that we made tremendous progress. And you're absolutely right. A lot of the things we're talking about here are rather consensus points in Catholic and Protestant world. I just add, again, on the scholarship question, the people who study these things, the Scripture scholars, I mean, they are terrific people. I mean, we've had Father Raymond Brown talk here, and Father Don Sr. has been here, and so on, and They do 2 kinds of studies on this thing I alluded to in my notes. One is what we call form critical study. And what they do with that is they try to trace the stories as it developed from the time of Jesus up until it appeared in the Gospel. They try to see how did the stories develop and how were they told in a different way in different communities and what was added and what was taken away. We call that the study of the form criticism. The other great study of our time has been what we call redaction criticism. And that is a study of the input of the 4 evangelists. What was their own theology? What was behind it? As you can see in the notes, I tried to help with that. You know, each one, for example, has a distinctive slant on Jesus. So when they hear the traditional stories that are told, then they put their slant on it depending on their audience and their interest. You got to remember, the guys who wrote these Gospels are not eyewitnesses of the events. They're people weren't there talking to Jesus.
Luke tells you that right at the beginning of his gospel. He had to investigate the sources to find out what was known about Jesus. But that is called redaction criticism. They are redactors or editors, and you can learn a lot about them. And you see that in the stories, what their interest is. And the way they slant the stories or retell them gives you their theology, tells us fundamentally what their theology is. Well, that takes us up to Luke. As I said in answering a question before, Luke's gospel is written in the middle 80s, and he had two sources, we know at least. He had Mark in front of him, and he had he had this Q document that I described before that's got in it the Our Father and got in it the Great Sermon. And Luke is a great writer. He's the best of the writers of the evangelists. He was well-versed in Greek, which he wrote in, of course, and tells a good story. He tries to keep it all balanced and so on. And in all of this, one of his slants on Jesus is that he is a prayer. In other words, in the other evangelists, he'll say, well, Jesus went and did this. But when Luke tells the same story, he'll say, well, Jesus, while at prayer, did this. Or Jesus was praying and then did this. So he's always bringing us back to Jesus as being in touch with the one he called Abba. And Jesus is the compassionate one. Just a little vignette from the Gospels. In the agony in the garden, Peter severs the ear of the high priest's servant, and only one of the four evangelists say that he healed the ear. That's Luke. In other words, Luke always is showing Jesus in a compassionate mode. No one else says that. So after you get to know the theology of the evangelists, then when you hear the scripture readings at Mass, they can mean a whole lot more than they would otherwise. You can begin to fill in or recognize what they have to say and so on. Well, that takes us maybe to the first of his stories here. This is the empty tomb story. This is all of this happens in chapter 24 of Luke's Gospel. And I just want to sort of comment on this as we go through it to try to bring out some ideas. Oh, I forgot who I'm speaking to, didn't I? Yeah. I'm speaking to Jacob. And the next person will be, the fourth one for John's Gospel will be, following the pattern. We had Abraham and Sarah. We have Jacob and Rachel. Thank you. Just to make sure everyone's paying attention here and catching the patterns. So we have husband and wife in both cases. So we got this one's Jacob, and Jacob, I'm picking up on his Lenten resolutions, and Jacob was very interested at the beginning. On Ash Wednesday, we asked everyone to make a plan for have a plan based on where we wanted to be by Easter. Well, Jacob, in his own mind, had a number of things that he wanted to do. He thinks of himself as far too judgmental, and so that he wants to become a more tolerant person. That's what his goal was during Lent. Too judgmental, harsh on people, often put people down. He didn't want to do that. He wants to be more tolerant and tender in his dealings with people. He wanted more interested in finding God in his everyday life. He's a very active man, busy, he's got a tough job, a lot of responsibility, he's often stressed out. And what he wanted to do was handle that better, and he wanted to be able to find God in his work site. He wanted to be able to see Christ, the risen Lord, in the people around him, so that he would get more, so he would be a more effective worker, but especially so he wouldn't be so stressed out by it all the time, that he could go in and stay calmer and be more reasonable in dealing with people and find himself energized instead of drained by what goes on at the work site. And he also, he had a big plan here. He had a big Ash Wednesday plan. His other thing that he wanted to do was to be more interested in the causes in the community, to be more interested in justice and peace and making the community a better place, trying to spread the kingdom of God in the world. And finally, he thought that he'd do all of this better if indeed he would get more out of the Mass. He thought that would be the center for him. If he could come to Mass every Sunday and get more out of it, then he would go out and be kinder to his family. He would have more energy for working for better civic relationships in the community. And he would find this deeper meaning at work. So that was his great plan during Lent, sort of centered on the crucified Lord and getting strength from the Lord. Okay, so now I want to go back when he's shaping his plan and suggest to him that if he concentrated a little more now in this post-Easter season on the risen Lord, he could enrich the whole thing. So he had 40 days before Easter to get ready. And he worked hard at it. Christ's suffering, passion, crucifixion, he's disciplined, he's working at it during Lent. So my suggestion to him is that he think of the 50 days after Easter as also a block. In fact, a block that could well be more important than the 40 days of Lent. I want him to start to think in those terms. That's a block from Easter to Pentecost. It's one season. The same banners will be up the whole time. We'll say the Gloria, sing the Gloria. It's a liturgical season. It's a whole thing. All the readings go together with what the resurrection is all about. So he's got a longer period than he thought. He didn't accomplish everything in 40 days. He doesn't have to wait till next Lent. He can go through the Easter season, resurrection, and find a new life, new enlightenment, inspiration, and so on. So that's the first thing. Now I want him to take seriously this whole resurrection theme. The risen Lord is going to help him. And I want him to concentrate on Luke's gospel. And I have a theme in it, in the resurrection accounts, which will help him. I want to center it on memory, remembrance. Now I'm going to go through this. Let's look for memory. Memory. That's our theme. So, the first day of the week, women come to the tomb bringing the spices. Found the stone rolled back. We're getting familiar with the other stories in this. It's not like the Gospel of Peter where we see how it happens and see the stone rolling, but it's back there. They entered the tomb. They did not find the body of the Lord Jesus. While they were still at a loss over what to think, 2 men. Now we had 2 here, and men, not angels. We got 1 angel before, now we got 2 men who are there, dazzling garments. The women are terrified. Fear has been a major part of this whole experience at this time. The disciples are in the upper room in fear. The disciples, when they find him in the tomb, they're afraid. A lot of fear going on here, so they're afraid again. The men said to them, "Why do you search for the living one among the dead? He is not here, he has been raised up." We recognize the language now. This is the initiative of the Abba, the Father, raises up Jesus. And then a telling word, remember. So this is what I'm looking for now. Remember says what he said to you while he was still in Galilee. Hey, you forgot. It might be part of the problem for Jacob. He forgets too much. He forgets a lot of things. It's interesting to start thinking, what does he forget that causes him the problem? So they forgot about what he had said when he was in Galilee. Remember that. And what had he told you was that the Son of Man must be delivered in the hands of sinful men, crucified, and on the 3rd day. 3rd day being, again, the decisive day. And Hosea says that, was that chapter 6, that on the 3rd day is when God does special things. Many times in the Hebrew Scriptures, it's the 3rd day that God does a decisive action. Same way here with resurrection. The 3rd day is extremely important. You got to remember this. And then it says, with this reminder, because someone told them to remember, with this reminder, his words came back to them. Now it's right. How did I forget that? He said that so often. How did I forget it? No, I'm going to be tolerant to that guy at work today, and I thought of that right away. How did I forget that and yell at him so quickly? How did I forget to do that civic involvement that I was intending to do? So forgetfulness becomes part of the... I'm halfway through Mass and I have forgotten to pay attention. I've forgotten why I'm here. Forgot that the Lord could meet me in the ordinary things of life. So with this reminder, his words came back to them. On their return from the tomb, they told all these things to the 11 and the others. Notice again, they don't keep silence. They do go and tell the 11. And then we get a different, you notice how there's always a different list of women? And they can't quite get it straight. The one constant is Mary Magdalene. One constant. All the empty tomb stories, Mary Magdalene. That's what makes the scholars think that what stands behind the tradition is that Mary Magdalene found the tomb empty. Story gets embellished. Somebody went with her. Well, he must have gone with her. She wouldn't have gone by herself. Who would have gone? You can imagine how that would happen. But the constant seems to be that Mary Magdalene had something to do with finding this empty tomb. But the story seemed like nonsense, and the others refused to believe them. Once more, we get the same thing. The testimony isn't good enough. They won't listen. No, even though they tell them that it's not good enough. Peter, however, now we get typically, Peter gets up and ran to the tomb. When we get to John's Gospel, we'll see the same thing, only he didn't run fast enough that time. Right? So we got that same idea both in John and Luke. Many people think there's a common source for Luke and John that gives the reason they got that same idea. Ran to the tomb. As we see in John's Gospel, someone else was running with him. So he went away full of amazement at what had occurred. Okay, so I'm after the remembrance thing here, right? And the way memory helps us to cope with life, the memory of things, the memory of the good things that have happened, the memory of the way Jesus has been at work in my life in the past should help me now. Yves Congar, I quoted a lot, says, what we got to do when you walk in the dark valley, you walk in the valley of darkness, what's important is to remember what you knew to be true on the mountaintop. That's what's important. Don't forget what you knew to be true in the good moments. Don't forget what you knew to be true when you felt close to the Lord, when the risen Lord was at work in your life. Don't forget that when you walk in the dark valley. So this memory becomes extremely important. Then we get the well-known Emmaus story following right upon this. This is all happening on this first day of the week. And now, interesting things to see. Well, I already tipped this one, but just think of the Mass as you hear it. Remember Mass. Two of them that same day, they're making their way to a village named Emmaus. Interesting, we don't know where this Emmaus is. We don't know anything about it. It tells us 7 miles away from Jerusalem. Even with that geographical help, scholars don't know that place. Of course, there have a lively exchange. Jesus approached, began to walk along with him, but they don't recognize him. Typical of all the stories. Mary Magdalene doesn't recognize him. Nobody recognizes him. Even the third time he appears to them in John's Gospel, they don't recognize him. They forgot already. They just seen him. They forgot. It's like something who didn't carry with them, so their memory. They were restrained from recognizing him. He said to them, what are you discussing as you go your way? They halted in distress, and one of them, Cleopas by name, asked him, are you the only resident? Doesn't know about these things. What things? All that's got to do with Jesus and that. Then their hopes are poured out. A prophet in word and deed. All the people, our chief priests delivered him up, crucified. And we were hoping that he was the one who would set Israel free. That's telling throughout all this, isn't it? Their hopes were all centered on Jesus as the Messiah. Apropos of this whole thing, remember I was telling you that Abraham, he made the stations. There's 14 stations, end with the burial. Jesus. A lot of people feel that it shouldn't be that way. There should be a resurrection, a 15th station, resurrection. And we're soon going to have that in here before Christmas. We'll have right back there, 5x7 icon of the risen Lord. And it's a triptych. There are 2 scenes flanking it. One will have Mary and Martha on one side, and the other side will have Cleopas and his wife in this triptych. So that we will sort of visually be trying to say what I'm trying to say here, that our Christian faith needs to be more centered on resurrection. It'll be the centerpiece will be the risen Christ icon, 5x7, large. And then my other reason for the comment is, I always wonder, only one person's named and the other one isn't. And so we are interpreting it to mean Cleopas and his wife will be the ones who are depicted here. So their point is all of our hopes, we were you notice where the substance of it, what were they hoping for? that Israel would be set free. What's the background of that? Israel's under oppression. They're an occupied country by the Roman Empire. What's their longing and their hope as oppressed people? To be free someday. Just like the Hungarians and the Czechs long to be free from the Soviet Union. There'd be a good modern sense of what Israel was going through. What was their hope? Hope was to have liberation, to have justice. That's a good thing to remember. That's a good thing for Jacob to remember when he's thinking about this involvement in the community, working for justice and peace. He is the one who would set Israel free. Then, interesting, Luke's great storyteller, he brings it all together better than the others do. Strange things have happened. You know, some women in our group brought some astonishing news at the tomb, failed to find his body, seen a vision of angels who declared he was alive. One of our number, we know that was Peter, went to the tomb, found it to be just as the women said, but him they did not see. The tomb was empty. So, these guys are fleeing, Cleopas and his wife, are fleeing Jerusalem. They're totally disillusioned. They're doing it even though one of their company, Mary Magdalene, came and said that the tomb was empty and that an angel, or two men, had told them that Jesus was alive. Again, they don't believe this. Then he said to them, "A little sense you have." And then he goes through the scriptures, beginning with Moses, for them. All that the scriptures had to say about him. Now they're intrigued. Again, this is their disciples. They know Jesus well, and yet they don't recognize him. So they say, "Stay with us." He had seated himself to eat, took bread. Now how does this sound? Sat down, took the bread, pronounced the blessing, broke the bread, and distributed it to them. All the Eucharistic themes. Familiar litany for us. That's just what we say. Takes the bread, blesses it, breaks it, and shares it. Very clearly a Eucharistic kind of remembrance. And with that, their eyes were open and they recognized him, whereupon he vanished from their sight. He said, now they remember what was happening on the road. Were not our hearts burning within us as he explained the scriptures to us? Now they're excited to return to Jerusalem, and they find the 11. Judas is gone by now. Greet them, the Lord, and they were greeted with, "The Lord has been raised. He's appeared to Simon." So here's where Luke is faithful to the tradition that we don't know how. No one ever talks about the vision to Peter, but he's got to get it in there. He's more consistent. Yeah, it already appeared to Peter. He was the first one before any of the rest of you. No, he appeared to Peter already. So Luke is making sure of that primary position to Peter. Then they recounted what had happened on the road, and now how they had come to know him, in the famous phrase, in the breaking of the bread. Come to know Jesus in the breaking of the bread. Well, again, I'm on the question of memory. One of the things that we say that happens in the Eucharistic meal is that we keep the memory of Jesus alive. We tell the stories. Do the same thing here. Tell the stories of what Jesus is all about. We have a liturgy of the Word. We listen to the Scriptures. Think about, reflect on what that all means. Keep the memory of Jesus alive. And then we do what he told us. Do this in memory of me, he said, when he celebrated the Last Supper. Do this in memory of me. Comes together, so we come as a memorial meal. We say in the Eucharist what happens is we remember Christ crucified. We remember what he was all about. We remember his earthly life. We remember his resurrection. He's the risen Lord now present in our midst. So it's a famous idea. And then, that still has a further resonance memory-wise. That meal that Jesus shared, the Last Supper, and the meal he shared with the people on the road to Emmaus reminds them of all the meals he shared during his lifetime. We call that the table fellowship of the Lord. That's the table fellowship. That's part of what he did. He went around and had meals with people, ate with people. It was in the meals. He go to Zacchaeus' house. Have a meal with him. Tax collector. That's what got him in trouble. Hated tax collector. Jesus goes to his house and has a meal with him. So there's a table fellowship throughout all of the New Testament, on the Gospels. There's the Last Supper. There's the meal with all. That's what we remember when we gather. That's the kind of broad memory that we need to keep in mind. And then the final part of Luke's story here, while they were still speaking about all this, Jesus appears in their midst. So they're in a room, presumably locked in this room, and he's right through the walls. Peace to you. And that brings back all the memory of the reconciliation, all the times that Jesus forgave people. The woman taken in adultery. Remember there's forgiveness available. Peace be with you. This is to the group that had betrayed him, who had acted cowardly, who had ended up abandoning him in his need. Even Peter denied him. In Jesus' first words, peace be with you. There is reconciliation. There is forgiveness available. Again, what's their reaction? They're frightened. Fear throughout all of these stories. They thought they were seeing a ghost. Why are you disturbed? Why does such a... Then you remember, one of the apologetic reasons for these stories is to make sure that people understand that this one they are encountering, this risen Christ, is the crucified Lord. That's part of why this story exists, written in the 80s. He wasn't a ghost. There's continuity between Jesus crucified and the risen Christ. Come, look at my hands. It's really I. Touch me. A ghost does not have flesh and bones as I do. He showed them his hands and his feet. They're still incredulous. They still don't know. And again, I point back that the doubt is, they're not doubting they're seeing somebody or they're encountering somebody. That's not the doubt. The doubt is this really Jesus? So he showed them his hands and feet. That was enough. So what does he do typically? Have you anything to eat? So they give him a piece of cooked fish, which he took and ate in their presence. And then what does he say to them? Recall. Remember those words I spoke to you when I was still with you. Everything about me in the law of Moses. Then he opened their minds as on the road to Emmaus to the understanding of the Scriptures. Remember what I told you. How could you forget it? I said it so often. I tried to get you to see it. You forgot it. You got to recall it. Keep it in mind. When you're in the dark valley, you got to remember what you knew was true on the mountaintop. And that becomes one of the reasons that we gather regularly for the Eucharist. Celebrate the presence of the risen Lord. Why? In a given week, it's easy to forget. Forget that the Lord was with us in all the ordinary things of life. Forget that there was strength there to be compassionate, and I should have drawn on that grace. Forget that I'm supposed to be attentive to the needy around me. And forget, so we got to come together regularly to celebrate the meal, the Eucharist, the sacred meal, this memorial banquet, so to keep the memory fresh, so that we can go off for the next week and draw on that strength and energy. And then he says, in his name, penance for the remission of sin is to be preached to all the nations, beginning at Jerusalem. You are witnesses of this. I set down upon you the promise of my Father. Remain here in the city until you are clothed with power from on high. Now, that's quite different. You notice for Matthew, the big appearance of 11 was in Galilee. Here it's in Jerusalem, because in Luke's whole gospel is based on Jerusalem as being at the center. Someone said, I have in the notes, it's a tale of two cities, Jerusalem and Rome. It's a tale of two cities, the whole story. So Jesus is in Galilee, but he must go to Jerusalem. He sets his face on Jerusalem. Peter says, don't go. He says, get behind me, you Satan. We got to go. That's where the prophet has to be. I have to go to the capital city. He goes, and there he meets his fate. He's crucified. And then he says, stay here. He appears to them not in Galilee as in Matthew, but in Jerusalem. That's the place. That's the center. Stay here, and then the Spirit will come upon you. And when you get the Spirit, then it will spread out. It will spread all the way out to the ends of the earth, all the way to Rome. Tale of two cities, from Jerusalem to Rome. It'll spread throughout the whole world. You are witnesses of this. I send down upon you the promise of my Father. And then he leads them out to Bethany. That's where, when they came into Jerusalem, there's a triumphal entry. They assembled in Bethany, came from there, triumphal entry in. Now he leads them out of the Jerusalem. They fall down to do him reverence, turn to Jerusalem filled with joy. They're in the temple constantly. That tells us that the early community continued to function as Jews. They continued to go to the synagogue, continued to follow the law, all of that. It wasn't like the next day they said, we got a new church. We're the Christians, they're the Jews. Got a whole decades, the whole first century. They're trying to define themselves over against the Jewish community or within it. They're in the temple constantly, and they're waiting then for the coming of the Spirit at Pentecost. The 50 days that I want Jacob to remember. So that's Luke's version of all this, and it seems to me the invitation is to let our memory work for us. Memory is crucial to being human. A friend of mine once lost her memory. It was a frightening thing. She had everything. It was just terrible. Well, we know that more widely. I mean, it was an episodic thing, but not Alzheimer's. Anyway, we're a product of that, and we have to we bring our past with us. I suggested that perhaps one of the things that happens here is a healing of memories. So we got to remember what we knew on the mountaintop, all the good and positive things, the times we have been successful and cooperated with God's grace, the times people have loved us and cared for us, times things have gone well when we felt the presence of the Lord. But then we got to also deal with the negative memories, when I disappointed myself, when I hurt other people, when I wasn't up to the task. All of those terrible memories that can plague me. Time with the bases loaded, I struck out. As a junior in high school. Comes back to me now. Still there. Dream about it. So, you got a healing of the memories. Risen Christ has the power to do that. So, I want Jacob to work on this memory thing. You know, I'd like him to remember how he felt when others treated him harshly. That's a good prod, to be kinder and more tolerant of those other people. How did he feel when he was an outsider? I want him to remember how he felt as an outsider. I want him to remember, as he goes through his day, probably saying a prayer in the morning and throughout the day, that it's possible to meet Christ in any situation in life, anything that's going on, work, recreation, family life, personal life, whatever, possible. Remember that. The Spirit may be whispering to me today, and it would be good to be tuned in. Spirit may whisper very softly today, therefore I'd better be quiet and listen carefully. I got to remember that on a day-to-day basis. It's so easy for me to forget it. I want him to remember all the advantages he's had. He's a successful man. He's rather intolerant of the new immigrants and the people who aren't in the same socioeconomic status. I want him to remember his own past, the past of his grandparents who suffered from the nativist prejudice in his country. I want him to remember that he stands on the shoulders of all those people who sacrificed so that he could be where he is today. That memory is a big part of being active, I think, for peace and justice, so other people get their chance, not just us. We ought to remember where we came from. We ought to remember the struggles of the people who sacrificed so much so that we could get an education, could have opportunities. You ought to remember that sort of thing. And I want him to come to Mass with memory intact, with remembering the week, remembering what went on, the good and the bad, and bring that there to offer to God. So my key in dealing with Luke's gospel and Jacob, who is serious about his Lenten resolutions made on his plan on Ash Wednesday, I want him to extend it, give him more time throughout the Easter season, and bring the risen Christ into it, not just the crucified Lord. The risen Christ who's here always and everywhere for us with power and strength. So let's do our thing. Now let us figure out timing. I have to backtrack here. Let's 2:30, 3:30. We want to have a time before Mass, quiet. That means we'd have at least 4. That means we'd want to be back here by 3:30. Why don't we say an hour from now, which is about 3:25. No one gets here on that time anyway, so we can... Let's shoot for 3:25. So this is a long period. Find yourself a good spot. I'm going to sit right over here for a few minutes if anyone wants to come and ask me anything. I'm going to sit over here.
Okay. Part of what I asked.
We know that in the risen Christ, He's the Lord, and is outside.
Tom, let me give you this.
We know that Christ, the risen Christ, is in glory and outside of our time and place.
Mm-hmm.
And it's mysterious. It's in a world that we don't, we only know by faith. And yet in our personal intimacy with Christ, like in the Eucharist or private prayer, we dialogue with Him and we are convinced that He's listening to us. He's more present to us than we are to Him. He speaks to us, but we're not hearing everything. And yet, at the same time, we know that this kind of dialogue is going on with millions of Christians. And you begin, at least myself, begin to wonder, is this really, of course it is mystery, but on my end of things, in time and in place, is this not 99.9% my own imagination?
Mm-hmm. I presume people heard, and I presume that's inviting a response. Let's see if anybody else. That might be a long response. That probably says something about what a lot of people feel in prayer and so on. I think that, the Christian conviction, as you well know, is that Christ, in His death and resurrection, moves beyond the time-space dimensions as we know them, that He is now, in whatever this means, to be in a glorified state, and that He becomes more present to the world than He could walking around in the year 30. I just give some background to that so that it doesn't sound totally unusual. Again, my mentor, who's back on the wall there, Carl Rahner, believes that for all of us, when we die, that we become more related to the world and not less. More available and not less. Which is, it's an interesting thing to ponder. I don't think most people think of it that way, and there's no empirical proof for that, but that is the way he perceives our own fate and destiny. That to move into the glorified state, to be resurrected ourselves, gives us a deeper relationship with everything that's going on in this world of ours. Which would, if you divide that kind of anthropology, then you'd say the same thing about Christology, that Christ remains more and more present to us. I'm not sure you have to tie the two things together, but that becomes our conviction that He's available in all cultures and all times. That's why art depicts Christ in the viewpoint of that culture. From that perspective. That's been our conviction all the way along the line. I think that the idea of presence is one to think carefully about. Presence is not, first of all, physical proximity. I think we can see that at one human level. there could be a person more present to you right now than the person sitting behind you. And we would all recognize that. That's the person that you love, that you're close to, who's in your mind, you carry that person in your heart. And in any real human sense, you're closer to that person now than you are to someone you don't know who happens to be sitting around you. So what that suggests to us is that presence is a kind of word that functions in a larger context. There's a human way of talking about presence that's not tied to time, space, physical proximity. And I think once you begin to broaden out presence like that, you get a better sense of how Christ can be present to people all over the world right now at the same time. Partakes of what we call the omnipresence of God as well. So, I don't doubt that, it can feel like it is all the conversation with Christ, my own imagination, and surely there's that input, and we all comes out of our own personality, our own character, our own history, our own mind functioning. There's no doubt about that. That was Freud's critique fundamentally, that, this is all illusory. However, one cannot disprove that or prove it, it seems to me. It's a matter, all of this stuff of resurrection
is finally based on whether those stories resonate with our experience. It's that synergism that gives them their power. If you just objectively step back and say, I'm going to read that story, well, that doesn't make sense. They didn't even bother to get the details right. You can easily do that. However, if you read the stories with a searching, inquiring mind, and then the stories, that's where my reflection questions are supposed to take us, then if I read those stories and I say, no, I know what they're talking about. When Luke talks about meeting Christ in a meal, I know that. It happened in my own family on Thanksgiving Day when we shared at a deep level. Now, I know meeting the transcendent in a meal is possible. And it's happened to me in the Eucharist. It's happened when I've gathered like this. I've felt the power of the Spirit. I felt energized. I saw things differently. I had a new perspective. It's that synergism that strengthens faith. So both things have to go together. And so while one can say it's illusory, and that's an opinion, and one can't prove it's illusory, and those people who bet their lives on Jesus end up in one way or another, maybe without thinking about it, of putting the apostolic accounts, blessed are those who have not seen and yet believe. We're going to get to that. That's the key. Blessed are those who have not seen and believe. We hear the testimony, we read the stories, and that's what I was trying to get everyone to do today, to interact with the story out of our own personal experience. Does it illumine something about my life? Does it help me see something clearer about my experience, something I might have missed? That's the way it's got to act. So it's not a matter of objectively buying their reports, nor is it a matter of just my own subjective religious experience and basing everything on that. It's putting the two together that's powerful, I think. And that tells me that it's not illusory. Long answer to...
How might you answer that question? What role does my memory play in my spiritual growth? We talked about that a lot, and we loved the whole idea of remembering here, but with that question we had a lot of different approaches to it.
Yeah, well, I'm sure. I mean, it's a provocative question. I mean, everyone's going to answer it in a different way. I think that, what I would draw on are those, what I'd call the memories of transcendence. The moments, the memories where there's been a mystery dimension at work in all of it. I tell this story all the time. People have heard me say it. It's one of my touchstones for biblical sense and of experience of mystery. And that's my father's later years. Before he died, he and my mother were going to drive to Florida together. And my mother said to me, your father doesn't drive well anymore. I'm afraid to drive with him. Talk to him and tell him to pay attention driving. I said, right, Mom, I'll do that. So I got him aside and I said, well, Dad, when we went to the golf course the other day, I noticed you were talking to me and weaving all over the road, and you better try to stay in it. Your mother put you up to that. Matter in hell. I mean, he's just violent. You're the one who gets picked up all the time by the police. I haven't had a ticket in years. I'm a perfect driver, and going on. And then suddenly he stops and he puts his arm around me and he says, well, we've got to talk about that fishing trip next summer. We got to pin those dates down. Well, that's my experience. I mean, that's memory's functioning two different ways. That memoried story. If you say, well, what does that remind you of, or how would I have that interact with a biblical story? I mean, I got that prodigal son story in my mind, that the father goes out to his son, waits for him, comes out and meets him, puts his arm around him, and says, let's go fishing. That's my memory. And when I hear God described as the wrathful God, a God of judgment you don't fool around with, I don't have any problem with that. I understand that from my father. I always understood it. I mean, I don't have any problem with that. God, you don't mess with God. I saw that. And so when I read the wrathful God, I got a picture of it. I'm okay with it. It doesn't make me feel guilty or bad or anything. You know, when I read that prodigal son story, I know that feeling of the son running out, the father putting his arm around him. So why, and then you could ask it further, I mean, why could I carry out my mother's thing like that and have that conversation with my father without saying, Mom, I can't do that. That's death, you know. I mean, you're going to be mad. You know, all of that's out of memory. That's out of memory from my father, and all the good times together and all the volatile times and all the reconciliations and all of that. That memory all feeds into it of why I would trust that experience and why it's a treasured experience for me and why I keep it in mind and I share it all the time. Because it's my sense of the Spirit at work. It's transcendence. It doesn't make any sense at one level, but at another level it makes all the sense in the world. There's mystery at work in that. There's a mystery of love that can withstand volatility. That's why I got along with Ronner. When I first met him, Ronner was just, you know, he was upset with me and he didn't like what I was doing and all this. And I knew from the word go that I'd get along with him. He said, the first time I met him, he said, you're going to write something? That's such things are as the sands of the seashore. And then he didn't like my German at all. Get an interpreter. You're terrible. You know, and none of that bothered me. Why? All memory of my father. It's all linked up. It's all my father. I mean, it's the same personality traits. And because I remembered that, I just took it in stride. I didn't feel bad or upset or anything. I said, no, I'm not going to get an interpreter. I want to talk to you. Just came back at him like that. Not going to. So we function out of memory all the time, and sometimes the memory raises a mystery dimension of life. And then you hear the biblical story, and that's back to Tom's point. I mean, the biblical story then illumines that, and that's what gives substance to it all. So that's just totally idiosyncratic. I mean, everyone's got their own answer to that question, but I took it as a personal question, so that's the way I would answer it. I'm going to go on. This is Rachel, right? Yeah, we had Abraham and Sarah and Jacob and Rachel. We could have had Isaac and... Thank you. Yeah, you were going to have that before. Anyway, we got Rachel. Rachel is an engineer and a very successful woman. I'd say driven through much of her life. Taught by her parents that she needed to succeed and accomplish things, and Rachel has gone about doing that, and very highly successful in school, and is successful as a mother and raising her family, and all of that. Great career going. She's a good Catholic, and she's dutiful about her religion. She goes regularly and to Mass, and so on. She wouldn't think of missing, and so she lives this life as with great purpose and so on. Now, what happened among her kids, a number of them have done well, and one of them, her youngest son, announced to her that he was changing religions, that he was going to join this non-denominational church, and that he was going to do so because he had met the Lord, that he had this personal relationship with Jesus established, and it was a clear, decisive baptism in the Spirit for him, and that he was now going to follow this path. Well, Rachel is just horribly upset with this. She's very unhappy, and she's thinking her son not following in the tradition of the family. She thinks, where did I go wrong? I've worked so hard at this and tried to be a good mother and do what's right and be a good example. And then she stops herself and she thinks, maybe there's something for me to learn here from my son. Maybe he's talking about something that I don't know that well in my own life. And that starts a process. And that's where I want Rachel, as part of that process, to read John's resurrection accounts. Now, I say just a little bit about John's gospel. It's so different than the other three. We call the other three the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, because they're so similar. You can put them in columns, 3 columns, look down the columns, and they will be often almost word for word the same. Same schema, same so on. So it's synoptic. You can see them together, and you can see them in these columns and see the similarities. John's gospel, when they write those books, they don't put that in there because you can't do it, because it is so different. There's no parables in John's gospel. And there's 7 miracles. Just the 7 miracles. It's all structured around those. And it's very big on encounters between individuals and the risen and Jesus, and then the risen Christ, as we're going to see. John's Gospel doesn't have that sort of liberation sense to it, that social justice sense to it. It's got to do with consciousness. To be saved is to see Jesus, to recognize Jesus, and because if you recognize Him, then you'll know the Father. If you know this, then you're going to be saved. That's where salvation comes in John's Gospel. It's very different. And John's Gospel is written last of all of them, probably in the middle 90s, and it's all centered on this one figure, the beloved disciple, who's unnamed. Never in the Scripture, we don't know his name. It's really odd. Never mentioned that. He's the one that Jesus loved, the beloved disciple. And it appears as though what has happened is that the beloved disciple, not one of the 12, establishes his own community, probably in Palestine, close to the heart of it all. It's composed of Jewish converts, Samaritans. They got Samaritans in there, some Gentiles. And they got their own way of thinking about who Jesus is. Oh, and they're not all that thrilled with the communities connected with Peter and the so-called apostolic communities, the ones established by the 12. They sort of think all that is too authoritarian. They like it to be a little freer floating. He never in that gospel never talks about the 12. He doesn't talk about apostles. It's always talking about the disciples. And those disciples all have a fundamental equality about them, because they get their discipleship from that personal relationship with Jesus, not by some chain of authority. Well, John's Gospel is just fascinating, from so many different angles, and written much later, out of all that the beloved disciple had taught them. And they were very proud of that and constantly emphasized that. So, maybe that's enough to say about the general understanding of John's Gospel. Oh yeah, I should say something about Jesus as he's portrayed in John. He's the Lord, He's the Master. I used the agony in the garden story before to remind us of Luke's compassion. Remember, only Luke says Jesus cured the ear. Well, look at that story in John. They come to arrest Jesus, and He says a word to them, and they all fall over. Just one word, and they all fall over. He voluntarily goes with them. They can't come and arrest Him, but never get Him. And just think of on the crucifixion scene. You know, in the synoptics, you got this, Father, why have you forsaken me? You know, I'm abandoned. Terrible. In John, right from the cross, Jesus is doing last-minute business. Well, John, take care of my mother here. Take care of my mother. I misspoke myself right there. You'll see in a minute. Shouldn't have said it that way. But take care of my mother. He's in command. He's dying here. So all throughout John's Gospel, He's the Lord, He's the Master. Nothing phases Him in that way. He's managing everything. Okay, let's go now and look at how John... We got a lot of material here in John. So, one thing you see right away, we got Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus burying the body of Jesus, and they also anoint it with 100 pounds of myrrh and aloes. This is enough for a king. Jesus is the king all the way through, so He's anointed like this. It also takes away the motive for Mary Magdalene coming to the tomb that you get in the synoptics. Remember, she comes to anoint the body of Jesus. Well, she wouldn't have had any need to do that, since that's already been done, and He's bound up in wrappings of cloth with perfumed oil and so on. So early the morning of the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene, we've got her prime figure again in John, as in the synoptics, came to the tomb, presumably because out of grief, or to pay her respects, not surely to anoint the body of Jesus. So she saw the stone had been moved away. She doesn't look in or do anything else. She just runs off to tell Simon Peter and the beloved disciple. Runs off to tell them. So now we get to the appearance of the beloved disciple. Tells them the Lord has been taken from the tomb. We don't know where they have put Him. Notice that her interpretation of the empty tomb is that the body of Jesus was stolen. No, she doesn't think, well, He's risen. She thinks, oh, they stole the body. Well, she goes back, tells them. Now, we've alluded to this before, we get a foot race between Peter and the beloved disciple. And the beloved disciple is in better shape than Peter. And he outruns him, gets to the tomb first. Well, he does not enter. This is written in the 90s now, when the conflict with the apostolic church is represented by Peter. Good chance that this is a reminder that you have to have respect for those other churches who don't have it quite right. Those ones that are with Peter, they don't quite have it right, but we have to have respect for them. So he doesn't go in the tomb. He lets the leader go in first, Peter. Presently, Simon Peter comes along, and he enters it. He observes the wrappings on the ground, saw the piece of cloth which covered the head, not lying with the wrappings, rolled up and placed by itself. Then the disciple who had arrived first at the tomb, that's the beloved disciple, he goes in, and he saw and believed. Okay, so Peter doesn't get it. The beloved disciple does. You can see the Johannine community here playing up their hero. Peter doesn't get it, but the beloved disciple is the one, and you'll see this later on, the same thing happens. He's the one who sees and believes. He understands what this is all about. Some would see the idea of the wrappings on the ground to contrast with Lazarus. When Jesus raised Lazarus, he comes out with all the wrappings on him. This time, Jesus, obviously, the wrappings are still there. Some said maybe a sign that they didn't steal the body, that it wasn't looking like there was a chaotic mess. It was done neatly and so on. Disciples go back home. Well, that's the interplay. That's interesting interplay between beloved disciple and Peter. And we'll see that going on later on as well. So you see, the beloved disciple always looks good in John's gospel. He's the one that gets it right. He understands. So meanwhile, Mary, this doesn't make total sense, but meanwhile Mary stood weeping beside the tomb. I mean, can't quite figure out how that happened. She went and told them, and then they came. So the author here didn't really bother like Luke usually tries to get it all straightened out, but this author didn't. Well, meanwhile, Mary stood weeping beside the tomb. Even as she wept, she stooped to peer inside, saw two angels in dazzling robes. Before, remember, there were no appearances. She just looked and saw the stone and went and told them. Now there's two angels here. One was seated at the head and the other at the foot. The woman asked her, "Why are you weeping?" Because the Lord has been taken away. So she still feels that the body of Jesus has been stolen, and I don't know where they've put him. This is a woman who's grieving the loss of her master, the one who all represented all of her hopes. So then, because the Lord, she had no sooner said this than she turned around and caught sight of Jesus standing there. But she didn't know him. "Well, why are you weeping? Who is it you're looking for?" She supposed he was the gardener. So we got another one of these situations where they don't recognize the man they know so well. It raises this whole question of the glorified body and all that. So she thinks it's the gardener. "Sir, if you are the one who carried him off, tell me where you have laid him, and I will take him away." Jesus said to her, "Mary." She turned to him and said in Hebrew, "Rabboni," meaning teacher. She recognizes him then. Of course, now one begins to see why this becomes important to Rachel. Mary doesn't recognize Jesus in seeing him. She recognizes his voice and when he calls her by name. You remember the sheep and the shepherd idea? Jesus says, "My sheep hear my voice. I know my sheep by name, and they hear my voice." That's John's gospel, and this is surely a resonance of that. The idea, do we hear the voice of the Lord? Are we attuned to it? And we should be, because Christ calls us by name. It's one of the things we're going to see that Rachel's going to learn from her son. Her son knows something about Christianity, Christian faith, that she hasn't learned in her life. Well, it has to do with this personal relationship with Christ, being called by name. So Mary doesn't recognize him saying, "This is the gardener." He simply says to her one word, "Mary." And this is the encounter that clicks. Jesus said to her, "Do not cling to me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father." Well, a lot of ink on that. Trying to figure out what that means. One possibility is that it means, look, I'm not going to be present in the community like I have been. That's not what's going on here. We're not going to get it back going like it was a week ago. That's not what it's about. Don't cling to me. It's one possible explanation for this. Or another possibility is that he's saying, well, I haven't completed my ascent to the Father yet. I've not been totally glorified. Therefore, you shouldn't be in that worshiping posture of holding my feet or clinging to me. Then we get a commission. You notice how often in these appearance stories you get a commission. Do something. Rather, go to my brothers and tell them, I'm ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God. Mary Magdalene goes to the disciples, I've seen the Lord. Then she reported what he had said to her. We don't get the usual bit here about, well, they don't believe her. Just reports that that's what she is to do. Also, one that interesting, he doesn't say go to my disciples.
And it brings back the memory of the Lord's Supper when Jesus says, I don't call you my servants, I call you my friends. Again, we're answering Rachel. We're back in that personal relationship. Jesus calls us friends, calls us by name. We have a personal relationship with Jesus. It goes across, Tom's point, all spatial boundaries. Time and space does not cut into that possible friendship. So she reports it, and then on the evening of that first day of the week, so we're still, all this is going on this Easter Sunday. Even though the disciples have locked the doors, the fear of the Jews, Jesus comes and stands before them, and then the great greeting, peace be with you. Peace, we've seen that before in Luke, to the people who had betrayed him, abandoned him. Then he shows them his hands and his side. The disciples rejoice. Now they're not afraid now. Shows them that he's really connected. He's the same crucified Lord. Presumably shows them the wounds in his hands and feet on the same one. Peace be with you, he says again. And then now the commission is, the Father has sent me, so I send you. That's the pattern in John's Gospel. He is sent by the Father, and then he sends the Spirit, and he sends us to carry on his work. He breathed on them. I suggest in notes that this reminds of, I was talking about the clay. God makes the clay, the human beings, and then he breathes into them. That's what brings them life. So this is like a second creation now. That's where we get the idea of the new creation. Paul Tillich talks about the whole New Testament as being the proclamation of the new being, the new creation, the new opportunities that come with the resurrection of the Lord. So he breathes on them, gives them the Holy Spirit, and this is for the forgiveness of sins. Okay, so we're back to that same personal encounter, Jesus with his disciples. It's a friendly encounter. He doesn't reprimand them, as he did in some of the other accounts. Doesn't challenge them. Peace be with you is his message. I give you the Spirit. That's the Paraclete, the one that will be within you and will guide you, and the Spirit of truth that I will send to you. So, in the same idea now. It is earlier in the Gospel. Jesus said, it's better if I go away from you. This is in his farewell discourse at the Last Supper. It's better if I go away, because if I go away, then I will send you the Spirit. And that Spirit will guide you. And you can trust that Spirit. And that will be the deep, emotional part of your whole religious practice and so on. This will be, the Spirit is within you. That's why you're all equal disciples. That's why you all have access to me, because of this Spirit. Maybe Rachel wants to learn something from her son about that as well. This power of the Spirit at work in our lives. Then a familiar story, I guess probably the most familiar of all the appearance stories. Thomas isn't there. They tell him we've seen the Lord, and he's not buying it. He wants to touch the wounds. So we get Thomas now representing, he's a great modern figure. He represents modern empiricism, the scientific method, the idea that the only thing that's worth knowing is what is empirically verifiable. I'm not going to believe till I can see it, count it, weigh it, measure it. That's the only thing that counts. All the rest of it is nonsense. You can't buy into it. So in that sense, Thomas is really a contemporary figure of all those who buy into scientism or empiricism. So a week later, Thomas is there with the others. Jesus is there again. Peace be with you. Come, take your shot. Touch me. Do not persist in your unbelief, but believe. And then Thomas doesn't do that. That's important in the story. Thomas doesn't go and touch him. It's okay. I get the point. And he says then the great, most complete creedal statement in the New Testament says about Jesus, the risen Lord, my Lord and my God. This is the strongest creedal statement of faith that we have in the New Testament. That's my own personal mantra. My Lord and my God. Said it thousands of times. My Lord and my God. There's a way of getting in touch with the power of the risen Lord. Then, great lines addressed to us. Blessed, you became a believer, Thomas, because you saw me. Right, you saw me. You didn't touch me. You saw me, became a believer. Blessed are they who have not seen and who have believed. So that's a statement to us. Blessed are those who have believed in the resurrection, who have drunk in the message, who have listened to the Spirit, who have responded to it. This is the beatitude that's addressed to all of us. Blessed are, we're the people who have not seen directly, weren't part of the apostolic experience, but have believed. So I'm back to Tom's point again. On what basis do we believe? Surely partly out of our own experience and out of the apostolic witness as we find it in the Scriptures themselves. Then we get the conclusion to the Gospel. This is very much like Mark. Jesus performed many other signs as well, not recorded here. They've been recorded so you might believe that Jesus is the Messiah and that through this faith may have life in his name. Everything tells you that's the ending of the Gospel. I mean, that's it. And however, we get, like we got in addition to Mark's Gospel, written by somebody else, we get this appendix, as it's used. Is that what it says in your books? The appendix. Well, whatever. The appendix, a continuation, is still another story. So we're going to have two endings to the one Gospel here. Just, I don't think that, I don't think we want to spend a whole lot of time on this one. Let me just emphasize the dialogue. The story is they're out catching fish. I mean, out fishing, they don't catch anything. Jesus says, cast the net over the starboard side. They do. They catch 153 fish. They bring it back in, and then Jesus has this meal with them. And again, you notice the beloved disciple is in the picture here. after they make the catch, the beloved disciple cries out to Peter, "It is the Lord." In other words, Peter doesn't know it's Jesus who told him this. It's the beloved disciple. Once more, is the only one who knows what's going on. That guy on the shore told us to catch him. That's who Jesus is. That's the risen Lord. It's the Lord. So then Peter jumps out and goes in to see the Lord. And then the poignant dialogue, 3 times, "Do you love me?" Get the personal interaction here. Imagine this, how Peter's been feeling, just ashamed of himself. Can't even stand to think about how cowardly he was. I like to play up the idea that he was denied Jesus not when challenged by a Roman soldier or faced with torture or something, but when challenged by a servant girl out in the courtyard. So we're trying to imagine this. How does Peter feel about this? No, and then Jesus speaks to him 3 times, "Do you love me?" Gives him a command, a commission. Feed my sheep, tend my sheep. It's Peter's rehabilitation, personal encounter with Jesus, forgiving, letting him know it's all right with us, and then making him the leader despite all of the mistakes that he had made. Then it comes back to the beloved disciple at the end and so on, which I think we won't go into. So, John's Gospel is filled with the personal encounters. Jesus interacting with individuals and calling forth the best in them, forgiving them, making them the leader, giving them strength, helping them deal with their doubts. So I guess I want Rachel to reflect on that. And she can learn something from the experience of her son, and maybe this dutiful religion that she's had can have a deeper spark. Maybe she can come to Mass and not just out of a sense of duty, but that she can get more out of it. Maybe at the Mass she can meet the risen Lord and warm her heart. And maybe someday she can talk to her son about the fact that she can throw her own arms around Jesus in an act of love. That when she goes to Mass, she encounters the risen Lord. That there's an emotional content to this religion of hers. She feels Jesus' love and care for her. She can say with her son, "I share with you this personal relationship with the Lord." Well, let us spend some quiet time. We're going to start Mass at 1:15 in here. So we'll try to start at 1:15. And the invitation is part of the dialogue homily, and when your reflection, it'd be nice if somebody would say, "Well, I was really taken by the Emmaus story, and it meant this to me." So an invitation to think in those terms. So some of us will get the church ready here, and let's spend our quiet time. Start at 1:15.